Hey, it looks like we are on. Howdy, everyone. It is good to see all of you. I can't actually see you. You look like a camera, but we do know you're out there. Welcome to another Tomorrow's World Now webcast. I'm here with this fascinating panel of gentlemen. On my far left, we have Mr. Dexter Wakefield. He's Director of Business Operations at the Living Church of God and an all-around nice guy. Though he's been in Florida, we don't hold that against him. Florida, just kidding. You're a great state. And then between the two of us is Mr. Peter Nathan, a professor at Living University, and another nice guy. I can't believe it. I get to share the table with two nice guys. My name is Wallace Smith. You may have seen me on the Tomorrow's World telecast, or I don't know where else you would have seen me, but we'll go with that. It's great to be here.
Do you ever share the table with a non-nice guy?
You know, if I would, I don't know that I would say it. I might just kind of say a nice guy and another guy, and then go on. So no, I would always be honest.
You could throw in good-looking and smart too.
Well, you know, I thought about that, and as some of our regular viewers might know that I've mentioned several times about how good-looking our people are, and I think they're starting to wonder about me. So I'm trying to hold off on that. Though I got to admit, you guys, snazzy dressers. I'll just say that, snazzy dressers. Our topic today for this particular webcast is about the world economy. Where are things headed, and how do we actually weigh these things in our mind? We're constantly seeing news about the economy all over the world, your local state or province, our country, personal economies. I'm currently trying to get children through college, and so I know it's on very personal economy is on my mind these days. And so we have a series of questions that have been put together, and we're going to take a look at these, take a look at some items in the news, and of course some spiritual principles. And before I say anything, I want to get this across. We are not here to give you financial advice. Go find a financial advisor. That is not our expertise here in terms of actually advising you about your investments or what you should do with your savings. Should you invest in widgets? I don't know. That's not what I'm here to talk about. We will focus on spiritual principles, but that's part of the lesson, I think, here on the Tomorrow's World Now webcast is every facet of our lives is touched by biblical and spiritual principles, and economics is no different. And before we get started, too, let me encourage all of our viewers, if you have a question, please, by all means, feel free and share it with us on Facebook. Right now, it's live at this time. If you watch it when it's recorded, I don't know, we'll be able to get back to it. But we have a couple of fantastic guys, snazzy dressers themselves, in our control room that will make sure we see those questions, and I'll do my best to keep an eye on it as well, because we love to address your questions also. So let me jump right into it here. The first topic that was put together concerns this report on the Federal Reserve Bank stress test. It actually was born out of a Wall Street Journal article published really just recently, June 1st, just this month coming to an end, how the Federal Reserve is coming up. They're working on new stress tests for banks. And then also they're considering new ways to regulate these different boards of these banks. And we were joking earlier about, well, what is this, a bank stress test? You know, they're putting the banks on treadmills, you know, are they making the CEOs wear blood pressure cuffs? Actually, Mr. Wakefield, if you could talk about that and help explain that to us, that would be great.
Yeah. Well, you see, the large banks have a huge influence on the economy. So what they do is they have a series of tests that they put their portfolios through. The banks have different things in their investment portfolios, and they say, well, what happens if, and how much money would they lose if this happened, or how much money would they lose if that happens? And they compare that to the loss reserves that they have in the overall capital of the bank. What we saw back 10 years or so ago was banks failing because they had all of these portfolios of bad loans and they could not cover the losses.
Right.
So what the stress tests do is it makes sure that they have the ability to do that.
Okay. So, well, actually, stress test probably isn't the worst word for it then, because that's what they do in medical stress tests with your body. They stress your body to see what it can take, and they monitor you to see whether you're going to, fall off the treadmill or something like that. And so they're essentially putting these banks through these scenarios to make sure they can handle a variety of different things. Yeah, their durability for different economic shocks, et cetera. Yeah. So, surely this is a good thing.
Well, it's a good biblical principle because the book of Proverbs talks about the prudent foresees the evil and hides himself from it.
Right. And
right?
Does this mean our Federal Reserve is busy reading their Bible? And
I don't believe so.
Yeah, we're not going to assume that. We're not going to assume that they're not. But it really is. And actually, I would say families could do similar. If you're not actually taking a look at your income and your outgo to understand what are we capable of dealing with and what are we capable of not dealing with, things catch you off guard.
And you could do a stress test on your own finances at home. What would happen if I lost my job? How long could I go, a month or 2 months before my cash reserves ran out or my mortgage went into default? You can do these things for yourself as well.
Right. Actually, the Bible talks about that, knowing the state of your fields, right? Understanding the health of your cattle, the health of your sheep. Now, most of us aren't investing in cattle and sheep, though some of you out there are. Doing that, what actually could we take? We might not like the answers, what we see, but at the same time, no one benefits from living in a world that's a lie. In fact, I don't know. We've had economic troubles. We had the economic housing crisis in 2008, et cetera. What do you think about that? From your experience, but you're both savvy observers of the world. At least that's how I see you. If you're not, don't tell me. Don't disappoint me. But what do you think of those crises, and how much of that was built on fantasy to a certain extent in terms of perpetuating a fantasy versus just simply not seeing the consequences? I mean, sometimes there's active ignore. I don't know. What are your thoughts about the previous crises we've had in the last decade?
Well, I could just start off. We were commenting before we went on camera. We were talking about really what had happened with the subprime mortgage crash. And I think many people understand that the government at that point, at a certain point, was requiring huge amounts of subprime mortgages being underwritten, up to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I think, up to 55%. And Wall Street was then processing these things, and people were loading up on the high-yielding debt, borrowing against it, and it was unsustainable. They couldn't go on. And there's I guess it's Herbert Stein's rule. It says if something is unsustainable, then it will stop. And,
it can be sustained.
Right.
Right.
The music stopped,
right,
and a lot of people got caught without a place to sit.
Right. Mr. Nathan, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but that's part of why you're here, as we put on the spot. Our perspective tends to be pretty U.S.-oriented because that's where we live. But for those who don't know, Mr. Nathan is a renowned world traveler. Africa, Atlantis. Have you ever been to Atlantis?
No.
No, all right. There's one still on his list.
We haven't decided finally where it is yet.
Well, if you get a plane ticket, I'd like to know. When all of that happened, when everything really went down with the housing crisis and such, what was your perspective internationally? Because that was really a ripple effect. It seemed like it sort of originated here roughly,
Yes.
but it didn't seem like it left anyone unscathed.
No one escapes, ultimately speaking. But in the Western world, so to speak, in terms of a developed Western world, the effects were the same. Because we have the same practices, the same lending practices in all of those areas. So everyone suffers. And of course, the United States occupying the situation it does in terms of a world's economy automatically creates a ripple effect.
Right.
And so forth. So it affects the banks elsewhere. In fact, talking about stress tests, the Bank of England has just gone through a stress testing process with the British banks. Fortunately, they're all passed.
Oh.
But all of the British banks were scouring the world to try and find additional capital at that point in time to meet their ratios, to make sure that they were able to operate according to the standards established. So it affected all parts of the world. Of course, some parts of the world, you might say, were less affected simply because people are so low on the totem pole of the economic system. But they all still suffer, ultimately speaking.
Right. Was there any sense internationally that the U.S. was to blame for? I've wondered if there was any sort of resentment out there, or was that not the case? In your personal experience?
If there was, yes, obviously, I had a meal with someone in London who said, if the U.S. government hadn't let Lehman Brothers go, it would have been no problem. So, yeah, the Americans get blamed in some ways. But it's a very human problem.
Right. I know we live in a situation where the economy is very managed, where you have a lot of people of influence, and I'm not trying to assume they're even evil, simply trying to create a healthy economic circumstance in which profits can flow and people are taken care of. But as a result, as things change, some of the decisions that are made can seem really strange, and one of those is negative interest rates. I wanted to bring that up because it's discussed. And we actually have, you might be surprised of some of the material we actually cover in the Tomorrow's World magazine. This is an older issue. This was from the September-October 2015. But we actually had an article in that. While we do focus on spiritual principles and prophecy, negative interest rates came up. I want to ask Mr. Wakefield to explain that because he actually wrote the article on this. You can go online and find it. It was called Deflation, ! Not just the word deflation, notice. Deflation, ! And you wrote that article, Mr. Wakefield. Could you kind of explain to us the concept of a negative interest rate?
Negative interest is not what your kid has in math class. Okay,
I've seen a lot of negative interest in math classes, just for the record.
And negative interest is when literally the bank is paying you to borrow from them, and that has actually occurred. And we're still having some negative interest. I think Japan is having negative interest paid on its 10-year bonds right now.
Really?
There's still some of that around. It's a phenomenon of deflation. It's caused by deflation or deflationary expectations. That's the opposite of inflation. In inflation, your money is worth less and less and less as the inflation goes up. With deflation, your dollar buys more and more and more when you have that. So as a result, the interest rates get lower and lower and lower, and they can actually go negative. The funny thing was that when this was happening, there were people, brilliant economists, who were saying, there's no such thing as a negative interest. And they found out they were wrong, that the interest rates did drop to below zero. Just as an example, let's say that if you bought a bond that was due in 1 year, and they promised to pay you back 5%. And so they paid you back $105 on a $100 bond. Well, that's 5% positive interest. But what if the contract said they would only pay you back $95? You gave them 100,
they
give you back 95.
Right.
That's negative interest. And that's going on all over the world and has been for the last number of years.
Now, I think some of our viewers might wonder, why in the world would you do that? Why would I loan them $100 if I'm only going to get back 95? But that's what I think is kind of a revelation, that economics can be so strange that that's actually a better deal sometimes than just holding on to your money, right?
Yeah. It's caused by deflation, a number of things, but just to be as simple as we can make it, it's caused by deflation. Let's say that deflation was going at 10%. And someone said, well, if you loan me $100, I will pay you back 95. You would still make money.
Right.
Because of the deflation or deflationary expectations. That's the important thing. It's a
weird world. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to have a currency made of goats and cows and that's it. But sometimes it seems like that would be a little bit. There's always a positive interest in goats and cows to a certain
Provided
extent.
the rain falls and there's feed for
That's
them,
right.
or else there is.
That's right.
They get thinner.
If you want to make it even a little more complicated and get everybody really worried about
I bet they can't wait. That's exactly what everybody wants.
I'm going to bore everybody to death. That was nominal negative interest, but you can have real negative interest, let's say with inflation. Let's say inflation is running at 4%, and you're only being paid 2% on your money.
Right.
You are losing a negative 2% on it as a real rate.
Huh.
So we've seen that around for a long time.
Well, let me steer things to a spiritual question. Part of the lesson of all this for me, just as a lay person sitting aside, is that the world is just trying to figure it out, and it's complicated, and things are getting awkward and difficult. What can people truly rely on then? You know what I'm saying? And you know where I'm going with this. Really, what can people do? What really needs to be their prime focus? Mr. Nathan, go.
Well, fine. Well, Zephaniah 2, seek the eternal.
Right.
This is a place to find your refuge.
Right.
So the Bible speaks constantly about the lack of security in physical commodities. And the only security is in spiritual items and spiritual character and spiritual relationship with the Father.
Right.
And without that, you're lost.
It reminds me of a comment actually I heard at a Feast of Tabernacles observance, and some of our viewers may have never heard of that before. It's a holy day in the Bible that we actually keep every year in the fall. And It was a pastor, a good friend of mine, and he mentioned that people sometimes they'll want to rely on him too much, and he's trying to be real about it. He says, "Look, I can't even guarantee I can get to my kid's soccer game on time, but God, you can count on. That's really where that investment needs to be." From that, let me kind of. It's tempting when times are good to rely much more on our stocks and our bonds and our incomes. And there is a lot of comments out there that perhaps the world economy really is rebounding. We've got some comments from Newsweek, et cetera. Things seem back on the upswing. There's people starting to think perhaps we're turning around and such. Is that the real trend? Is really in the long term, does the Bible provide any guidance in terms of what we should expect? Or should we be shocked that things are getting better?
Well, it's interesting that the Newsweek article does have the caveat. It seems to be improving, but is sort of being held back by problems in the United States.
Yeah, You're going to blame us for everything.
They seem to want to. That's right. I'm not saying to blame.
I can't blame them for blaming us.
Newsweek.
We probably deserve it. So.
Well, if not, hopefully we can take it. Hopefully we're grown-ups. Right there, the part is, and when it comes to understanding prophecy, is there's an arc. There's this overall, the details, things go up and down, and so many times people want to see something and say, "Oh, that's what prophecy predicted," and then things will change somewhat. Prophecy is all about the end game in terms of where things are headed, and when it comes to trying to understand what's going on in the news, you always have to keep that in mind. You can't actually just take a look at prophecy says that the dollar is going to go down because the dollar might go up for a time. How is God going to fulfill his purposes? Is it going to be because he's going to cause, say, powers in Europe to just rise by continually doing successfully? So let's invest in Europe? Or is there going to be a crash coming that so devastates them that they reorganize in a way nobody ever would have expected? And so we have to understand that prophecy is really talking about an overall arc in terms of how things are progressing, as opposed to the minutia of day-to-day changes.
And of course, the pundits get it wrong too.
What? Surely not.
Sure,
those guys are so smart.
You look at the United Kingdom with Brexit, and everyone said, the pound is going to go down, and consumer confidence is all going to disappear. And what's happened? Consumer confidence has stayed up. The pound is now increasing. It's now over $1.30, and so on. So exports have increased. The Europeans are stocking up on their commodities from the UK, but things since the Brexit vote have gone remarkably well for Britain.
Right.
Right, and I certainly agree with what Mr. Smith said about that, is that right now the global economy is running maybe 2-3%, and some are much better, some worse. So the economy overall is doing fairly well for now, but there are a lot of major structural issues in the economy that the macroeconomists are looking at and saying, how on earth are we going to deal with these things? I'll just give you a couple of examples of them. Reading from a paper here that is a newsletter I get from a macroeconomist. It says the largest twin bubbles in the history of the world, which are global debt, especially government debt, but also private debt. That's one of them. And then government promises. And these things have grown to massive proportions right now. Just to point out a couple of other things about this, if I can get to a couple of these quotes. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the 20 largest economies, some of the 20 largest economies in the world, their unfunded pension liabilities, and I'll talk about that in a moment, they are $78 trillion. And this is from Citibank, a Citibank report, so this is not what some pundit thought.
Wow.
And that's at least 50% more than their total annual gross domestic product.
Huh.
So,
what was that source? What are you reading from?
It's from a Citibank report.
One of the things that principalglobal.com actually had a list of top 10 economic trends for 2017. And it was fascinating how, all this is these particular people's opinions. It's their best they're trying their best to do some particular analysis. And they mention what's going on. Well, there's uncertainty concerning Europe. There's so much new leadership in the world. Donald Trump in the United States, definitely there's a certain element of question about what in the world is exactly going on. The fact that the choices that are made, the implications of those choices don't really happen till much later. what I see is sometimes prophecy moving in the variability, the things you actually can't control. There's a reason when you talk about runaway inflation, for example, there's a reason the adjective runaway is there. Because, so well, why don't they just intervene and stop it? That's the point. They actually can't stop it. And I see increasingly we seem to live in a world where we think we can manage all these facets somehow. We just dial in the right interest rate. We just do this. And I think the lesson that's really coming is that mankind can't run all these things perfectly. We just can't come up with this perfect system.
An interesting addition to that is the latest British election. The overall result is that people are fed up with austerity. Okay? So here's another, you might say, government promise and so forth. We don't want to have to do this all the time. You know, we have borne the result of austerity since 2008 and forever before that.
Right.
And we want to have some of the good life. We want in on it.
Well, austerity in most of these countries means that the government cuts spending so that they are operating within their means.
Right.
And these promises, particularly unfunded pension liabilities in the U.S. and abroad, huge amounts of money. What these economists are saying, they're using the word the Great Reset. At some point, just like a government or a company going bankrupt, they have to reset everything.
Right.
And this is coming down the road at some point.
Right.
The question is, what will happen when that happens? Who's going to do it? Who's going to profit? Who's going to be the winners and the losers? And it could be that some great genius is going to come up and figure out how to do this and solve this problem. If he can do it, there will be huge power to anyone that does that. And the Bible does talk about such a situation.
Before we move on, actually, let me read some questions that are coming in from Facebook. We had someone from Texas. So go Texas. Texan can't help it. Said, is free international trade a good or bad thing according to the Bible? He says, I've always wondered, it seems to lead to a lot of inequalities, but maybe there's a green behind it. I'm not sure what he's saying there, but maybe there is a good way to do international trade. Is there anything biblically that would comment on international trade as a pro or con?
Well, background, there's a lot in the Bible that speaks about international trade because Israel, the state of Israel, lay between the two superpowers of Mesopotamia and Egypt. And the trade between those two provided an incredible amount of riches for Israel. So this was a factor in the ancient world, and the nation of Israel benefited from it in a very profound way.
Right.
It also has to, well, what it does is it enlarges your markets. You have a much larger market for your produce to go to. The trouble is you're buying from them as well. So that has to be balanced between the two. The problem comes when it gets imbalanced. There's a great imbalance between them.
I think there's another question that I want to make sure I get to, because thank you very much, everyone sending in questions. We definitely do want to address them. I thought it was interesting. It's an interesting question. He asked, I say he, I don't know if it's a he or she, I apologize. For me, it just says FB question. If that's actually your name, I would like to get to know you. That's a very interesting name. So Facebook question, can a people go into captivity and yet its currency remains strong because its banks are propped up by maybe the Assyrians? We're probably talking about Germany. It's an interesting question. Is there any reason, if a country's currency is still strong, is there any reason why it wouldn't be able to go into a captivity?
The answer to that, I think, depends on how you perceive captivity. Basically, the whole world is in captivity at the present time. Because the book of Proverbs, once again, tells us that the borrower is servant. In other words, he is a captive to the lender.
Right.
And each and every person watching this program at the present time is captive to a lender somewhere.
All right. Yeah, Mr. Wakefield.
Mr. Nathan has a great point about that, and that is that we as Americans are, in a certain sense, liable for all of this wonderful debt, this trillions and trillions of dollars that's piling up, and they're predicting that even more is going to pile up in the next few years. So could we wind up becoming captive to that debt while we having a functional economy? It's an interesting question.
It really is. I mean, actually, your currency could be strong for all the wrong reasons. And actually, it does remind me, even though we have other topics where this might come up. I can't help myself going to Ezekiel 7:19, where it speaks of a people being punished for their sins. And it says that they'll do what? It says they'll throw their silver into the streets, and their gold will be like refuse. Their silver and gold will not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. So you're talking about people going into captivity who have silver and gold.
Right.
They're actually plentiful with that, and they're throwing it in the streets because it's doing them no good. Because when God acts to bring a people into captivity, and if you have not read our booklet, The U.S. and Great Britain in Prophecy, you absolutely must read that booklet. It's not going to save them. So even if it is present, no, it's not going to make a difference.
It's interesting about the silver. Have you seen these ads for buying silver on television? I don't watch
Not in
that
a while.
much, but there have been a lot of ads, buy silver, buy silver. It says that they're going to throw the silver in the streets, but their gold they're going to declare unclean. That was actually the biblical quote. It's interesting that
They were giving that quote in the...
No, they weren't giving that
Oh,
one. Now,
all right.
I actually looked that up before the.
Do you read the Bible every once in a while, Mr. Wakefield?
Occasionally,
Do you
yes,
really?
I do,
That's a good idea. I'm going to start doing that.
I really like Isaiah's account of that same thing, because he talks about them throwing their gold and silver into the street and becoming mole and bat feed.
Really? I got to start quoting that one, and yet I don't know if I want to now that you've described it that way. Ezekiel's been my go-to, but I'll consider Isaiah. You said that wonderfully. Could you say it again?
Isaiah?
Ah, that was amazing. You got to say that every few minutes. All right, a question comes up every once in a while. I just want you to put it straight, and we can make short work of this one. Tell me straight, gentlemen, do I really need to pay taxes? I mean, I got to admit, I don't want to sometimes.
Well, we
Question
can
comes
always,
up, do I need to pay taxes?
We can always cut your salary. You will not need to pay any taxes. And that's one solution.
I'm not interested in that, frankly. No, really, biblically, it comes up sometimes. Really whether a Christian should or ought to, but biblically, it's been answered. Any comments?
Right from the beginning, when Israel asked for a king, Samuel said, "You're going to have to pay taxes." Jesus Christ telling them to pay what was Caesar's and render to God what was God's.
Right. People try to make complicated arguments one way or the other, and I don't want to judge their motivations or anything like that, but at the same time, the Bible really does make it plain. We are to be the best citizens we can be within God's law, within our countries, and absolutely. If you look at Paul, you look at Jesus, who was in charge when Jesus talked about it? He said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. And I don't know, at least the history books I read, those guys don't have the best records in terms of how they were spending all of that.
And there's a direct New Testament reference to that in Romans chapter 13, verses 6 and 7. It says, render to all their dues, taxes to whom taxes, custom to whom custom. That's the New King James Version. It says taxes for that. So we should pay our taxes. We should not be rebellious about that according to the Bible.
Right. Okay, good. So just that's our official word here.
Or
here
you
at this table.
relocate to a place that does not have taxes.
That's always an option, right? Go live someplace. Or ask your employer not to pay you, like you're talking about, and then you won't have anything.
No income taxes.
No income. That might make it easier
You
for
don't
our
have any
budget.
income to pay sales taxes on either, so
That's
you can
right.
avoid it that way.
I think if you didn't do that, it'd make it easier on your budget, but not on my budget if I did that. Okay, this is a good question that was selected for this one. I appreciate this because there's a lot of debate in our current society, at least in America. Sometimes I feel like there's less debate in other countries, but it's just probably because I'm not there. Is how much regulation should we really have? Should the government take a strong role in terms of regulating an economy, in terms of actually, we talk about Dodd-Frank, all these other regulations. They're currently in the news a lot. Is there a spiritual position on that? Should the government be doing so much regulation, or does it need to be a hands-off, just kind of laissez-faire to an extreme for those who know stuff like laissez-faire? I feel more educated when I say it. And just leave everything alone. Let it go and just let the economy be what it's going to be. Are there any spiritual principles to bring to bear as a Bible-believing person tries to comprehend these issues?
Well, and it's always been appropriate for governments to put up regulations. Even capitalists want regulations because it creates a level playing field. It creates standards for everyone to work by and sort of keeps the bad guys at bay within an economy. Sometimes government gets to be excessive, and that becomes a very political issue that they have to work out in their own way in the world. You mentioned Dodd-Frank. Even the sponsors of that bill are saying that it hurt the small banks. The regulatory requirements and the reporting requirements of this were so great that the small banks could barely be in business in doing. So the larger banks, who could do it much more easily, were saying, this is kind of a good deal because it's hurting our competition a bit. But it was hurting them some also. So as to how much that needs to be adjusted, the process is underway. But these things go up and down within the government.
Right. Mr. Nathan, any
And
thoughts?
part of a problem is we think one size fits all. So we have one form of regulation without any real sense of how does this apply in different sizes or different circumstances.
Right. I know, speaking as an American and a Texan, which makes it even worse, I will be honest, there's this idea that, no, we need to be on our own, like the old West. It's all up to me. We need to be left alone to sink or swim. It's very easy to judge your country's approach to things to being the best, especially when you're in America and you don't distinguish the blessings, the success of our country from the blessings that have come upon it prophetically because of the blessings on Abraham. But I agree, there's not really an ism that seems to work fully all by itself. Capitalism, socialism, communism, all the rest. It's really just Bibleism. I mean, eventually there's going to be a world here that Jesus Christ runs in which there is going to be regulation. The Bible talks about laws of God that will be centrally imposed upon leaving the corners of your field for people to come and glean. And yet at the same time, if you don't work, you don't eat. There's a balance there somewhere that will be present in the kingdom. I think part of the challenge is today we see so much regulation because humans are fallible. It's not always because of evil desire, though let's not pretend evil desire doesn't come into play from time to time. But it's just because we're not perfect. We just don't understand. And I'd hate to live in a world that's over-regulated, but I'd hate to live in a world that's under-regulated. And really, where is the medium? We do have another question from Facebook I thought was pretty interesting.
If we just add to that, in terms of regulation,
Yes.
the whole question of the internet and regulating the internet, and how do rural communities get high-speed internet access
Right.
without some form of leverage over the ISP or the providers?
And back in the 1930s, they had the rural electrification
right.
that put out electricity in all the rural areas. There's certainly a role for that. But the Bible does say that it is not within man's ability to govern himself.
Right.
He can't do it right. So they will always be struggling to do this until, in this age anyway, until God brings his kingdom.
Right. The way of man is not in himself.
Yes.
But that's the problem. So the way is not in me, but who else do I have to look to other than other men? You know, there's other men, different layers of government. Eventually, if that doesn't stop at God, it's always going to be something fall
But
short.
of course, that's a lovely scripture to quote. How does it carry on? He says, "O eternal, correct me, not in anger, lest you bring me to nothing." So in other words, a realization, hey, there's somewhere I have to go to look for the answers.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I might be a lot of people quote the say. No one likes to quote the parts of the verse that say, correct me. That's
right.
no one's favorite part of the verse.
Regulate me.
Let me. Yeah, we can translate it that way. That would be very nice. Very nice. Okay, we do have a question. I thought it was pretty interesting. Someone asking, and this is going to be speculative, so just what do you guys think? They asked, how could conflict with North Korea, which is always in the news these days, how could that affect the world economy? We are not financial experts here or world economy, but I think we could speculate a little bit about some things. To me, personally, I'd throw it out there. I think it'd be an additional chaotic element that could go either way. I mean, World War II affected different countries differently in terms of how they participate in such things. But I don't know. Any thoughts? A fellow on Facebook invested enough to ask. I thought I'd like to give him something.
Well, it's very close to China.
It is.
And China is a major player in the world economy, so where does China sit in terms of a relationship? Where does Japan? So you get these Taiwan and so forth. You get these major manufacturing centers for the earth, very close by, and being affected.
But don't forget the law of unintended consequences.
Right.
And that is that the biggest consequence of any action that these people take is going to be unintended.
Right.
And I'm afraid that if people go off and start a shooting war over there, if unavoidably or not, the consequences could be far-reaching.
Right. It really is the ripple effect. You know, you throw the pond in the lake, and you did that. You did that purposefully. You knew exactly. Maybe you hit it exactly what you were going to.
The stone in the lake.
Well, no. So I throw ponds actually. It's kind of a metaphysical thing. It's like I don't know. Totally got me. Good job, guys. I said they were sharp. No, so you throw a rock in the lake.
That's right.
We go with that rock.
Yes,
All right.
that's fine.
And so the ripples go out, but the thing is, once you let go of the rock, one, you're not in charge. Isaac Newton is sort of in charge in that trajectory. Hopefully it lands where you want it, but even then, you don't know what was under that, where it hit. All the ripples go, and it touches every part of the lake on the side. It's one thing to say we need to do this, but, I mean, really our country's still affected by choices made in Vietnam, World War II, really World War I, and you can't control all those
July
consequences.
4th's coming up, isn't it?
It is.
We're still suffering from...
That's right, from the American Revolution. Boy, you go far back. I was going to ask if you were there, but that would be a terrible thing to ask.
Not.
I won't actually do
Not
that.
even metaphysically.
All right, we did have another question I want to bring up, but as we're going to be getting close to wrapping up here pretty quickly, but the question about gold. Is gold an investment that will help my family in a catastrophe? It seems like there's always talk about gold. Through every kind of financial crisis, people start rushing there. And any observations or comments on gold in terms of how should we think about that as people focused on a larger picture than perhaps some are?
Just remembering a little bit of portfolio management, and this is not my advice by any stretch of the imagination, but portfolio managers say for individual portfolios, it's okay to hold a certain amount of gold. They may say 10 or 15% of something in your investments, and that is a hedge against inflation. Before we went on the air, we were talking a little bit about gold versus oil. If you go back and look at the last 20, 30, 40 years, the amount of oil, the number of barrels that an ounce of gold will buy has been fairly constant. An ounce will buy between 20 to 30 barrels of oil.
Right.
It varies all over, but it always kind of comes back to that particular range simply because of inflation and because of market forces. So people use gold in a worldly sense as a hedge against inflation. But you can't put your trust in gold. That was in Ezekiel, by the way, where it said they will consider it unclean. That's Ezekiel 7:19.
All right.
Their gold will be unclean to them simply because they had trusted in it before, and they should not have.
Right. I've heard that talk that gold is mentioned in the Bible. I heard one, actually, a fellow I really respected. He was someone I looked up to, and is an ex-Marine trying to make a point like, no, you can't, diamonds are a false investment because the Bible doesn't talk about diamonds, but it talks about gold, and so gold is a real investment, and whatever. The Bible does talk about gold, but the idea that, well, I'm going to put all my money into gold because it's mentioned in the Bible, God considers it a value, later on. I think Ezekiel 7:19 and others just highlight that there's no single thing worth our trust. There's no magic bullet. I don't want to call gold a silver bullet. It seems like that doesn't exactly work.
No.
But there's no single investment that we can really rely on. Talk to your financial advisor. They'll probably say things like, diversifying gives you more stability. If you need more risk, make sure you narrow it or something in wise ways. But sure, gold should be weighed like any other kind of investment. But is there something prophetically that says it's a better investment than others? Not necessarily. Again, Ezekiel 9:17. There's going to be people there's going to be people maybe wishing they had a sandwich instead of the gold nugget they have sitting on their dresser. So.
You can't eat it. And also in the same
you could, but
scripture,
you're probably going to regret it.
Calls it a stumbling block of sin. And people like to point out, and they say, well, the Bible says that money is the root of all evil. The Bible does not say that. No, it doesn't.
Root of evil.
No, it says the love of money is a root of all evil. So you have to remember that it is the love and the desire of it that creates the sin.
Yeah, I had heard a woman tell me recently that chocolate is actually the root of all evil.
I always thought it was pretty good.
Well, I hope that's not the case. I hope that's not the case.
I'll eat that.
Someone asked a question here on Facebook that I'll pass on. Talk about the Industrial Revolution. It's a broad question, but feel free and give your input to this person. Was the Industrial Revolution a good or bad thing? They said it seems to have kind of brought us to destruction in some kind of way in the long term. I guess you could almost say the question, should we just be an agrarian society? Is there something inherently self-destructive in terms of being an industrial society?
Well, we can do what we're doing now as a result of an industrial society.
We know that because we're doing it now.
That's right. But we couldn't if we hadn't had the Industrial Revolution.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Right.
So,
And back in the days of the agrarian societies, children died young. There were the medical care, all of these other things. Lifespans were very short. The standard of livings were extremely low.
Right.
I don't think anybody really wants to go back to that. We enjoy our productivity and what it means.
Yeah. To me, a lot of it goes back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Mankind keeps advancing, but it's always at some kind of cost. We can't just kind of think of a pure step forward.
It is not within a man's means, within his heart, to guide his own paths.
Right.
We have to use this book, what God says, and if we do that, he puts us on the right path, and that's the one we follow.
My children and I often talk about when Christ returns, what sort of society are we going to have? And are there going to be cars? Are there going to be bicycles? Are there going to be hovercraft? That would be really nice. And I've often thought, we'll see. It's in man to create. God's a creator, right? God actually, he made all of this, essentially, what we are. And if mankind has a chance to express his creativity in such a way where he's guided by the leadership under Jesus Christ, what kind of economy are we truly going to have? What kind of investments, what kind of inventions and all the rest? Yeah, we have a comment from our very wise folks over in the control room commenting that Mr. Herbert Armstrong used to say, it's not the thing itself that is bad, it's the use of the thing in terms of how it's used one way or another. And I would say even how it's developed, if it's developed out of lack of consideration for others or with them in mind.
Well, much has come from military defense research and so forth. So it's developed in the first place with a destructive element.
Well, the questioner also brings up a good point that in the kingdom of God, things will be very different spiritually. We will not be in Satan's world. He will not be active as he is now. Right now, the best thing we can do, or we think, is to live in this industrial age.
Right.
But I've got a feeling that Christ is going to come up with something pretty different.
I do.
Looking forward to seeing it.
Will it be the Jetsons? Do you remember the Jetsons? That's not. I don't know how many of our viewers remember the Jetsons. But anyway, I like to think that man is going to be not just blessed in terms of spiritual things, but unleashed in a certain kind of way. Where he actually has a guide that says, "Oh, look, I know that thing you just made looks great, but let me tell you about Los Angeles. Let me tell you about the smog, and let me tell you about that." Because even with the purest of intentions, we can't see around corners. We only see so far into the distance. That's part of what I've argued, that it's not just a matter of man's character has to be perfected, because even if we all had the best of intentions, we can't see like unintended consequences. We can't see the results of our decisions 100 years down the road, even our economic decisions now. How are they going to affect things a century from now, even if all of our intentions were good? Without the leadership of a loving, giving God to ourselves, we're just not sufficient.
I see this playing out in countries like Kenya, which are almost, you might say, going through this transition from agrarian to industrial societies. Kenya is a wonderful place to grow flowers for the European market. Kenya is to flowers what China is to electronic equipment, Bangladesh is to cotton. And every night, the plane loads of flowers leaving Kenya for European markets. Okay, great employment for the Kenyans. But the downsides of it, the nitrogenous runoff into lakes, which then choke the lake with weeds so that the fish can't operate, you immediately destroy someone's livelihood. You bring people together from villages into shanty towns to work in the fields, etc., or the covered houses and so on. And what problems do you create? You create all sorts of sociological problems. You create problems back home because father's not there to be involved in his children. So, so we make these decisions which may appear to be great and wonderful, but they all have those unintended consequences.
I'm just excited that we had some topic that gave you the chance to say nitrogenous.
I was waiting for that.
That was amazing. You write down my favorite words that Mr. Nathan says on the webcast. That really is all that we have time for. I want to thank our guests again, Mr. Wakefield, Mr. Nathan, as well as our amazing crew in there, Mr. Dawson, Mr. Leonard, Mr. King, Mr. Siselka, watching online. We know you're out there, Mr. Siselka. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and we will see you again again next Thursday at 3 o'clock. And thank you guys.